Initiating development with king's knight signals intent to control central squares. A flexible approach paving the way for various pawn structures. Mirroring white's development. This knight secures a central foothold while keeping options open for further piece placement. Establishing central control. White immediately stakes a claim in the heart of the board, preparing for future pawn advancements and piece development. Embracing the fianchetto allows black to challenge white's central ambitions and prepare for rapid development on the kingside. Solidifying the queenside. G3 prepares a fianchetto and supports a central pawn advance, aiming for harmonious piece development. Developing the bishop to its longest diagonal capitalizes on the fianchetto structure and pressures the center. Developing the bishop to the long diagonal strengthens control over central squares and prepares for kingside castling with tempo. Securing the monarch now prioritizes king's safety, establishing a harmonious defensive structure for the upcoming skirmishes across the center. Securing the king with castling is paramount in this fianchetto setup, building a solid foundation for queenside expansion. Asserting central space. D5 challenges white's queenside pawn structure and aims for active piece play. Boldly advancing the knight to the advanced outpost on e5. White immediately challenges black's central pawn structure and eyes the vulnerable f7 square, aiming to disrupt black's harmonious development and potentially initiate tactical skirmishes or force positional concessions. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for a potential queenside expansion. Black reinforces the d5 square and creates a supportive pawn triangle, eyeing further development and potentially challenging white's central knight. Exploiting the slight hesitation in black's development. White immediately injects dynamism into the center by challenging the d5 pawn, aiming to dismantle the compact pawn chain and potentially open lines towards the kingside. Embracing the open center. Black concedes pawn territory to provoke a more complex pawn structure, potentially creating dynamic counterplay on the queenside and inviting the knight to a less stable outpost. Seeking active piece placement. White redirects the knight towards the queenside, aiming to contest the isolated d5 pawn and potentially support a future b4 advance, all while ignoring black's central pawn grab. Unleashing a knight into the enemy camp at g4 creates immediate tactical friction, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around white's king and potentially disrupt development. It's a bold assertion of attacking intent, gambling that white's pieces won't adequately coordinate to repel the knight's presence. Unleashing a knight to a prominent central outpost. This recapture immediately challenges black's pawn structure and opens lines for white's queenside pieces. Striking at the knight's occupation of the central square. Black initiates a pawn exchange that, while seemingly simplifying, potentially opens lines for white's pieces and alters the pawn structure on the kingside for good. Reclaiming the knight establishes a potent central outpost, eyeing the weak squares and potentially cramping black's queenside development while preparing for a pawn push. Reclaiming the knight to d7 initiates a strategic retreat, aiming to regroup and reinforce the center while simultaneously preparing for potential pawn advances on the kingside or a more dynamic setup in the center with the e-pawn. This repositioning avoids an immediate clash and allows black to build a more solid structure. Observing white's intentions. Reclaiming the central outpost is a strategic priority, aiming to consolidate piece activity and prepare for pawn advancements. Unlocking the queen's diagonal access initiates a fascinating positional contest, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around the monarch. Solidifying the knight's outpost while preparing for a pawn-pawn expansion down the queenside. This maneuver aims to gain space and restrict black's counterplay. Introducing the rook to the central d-file offers black a chance to exert pressure and potentially challenge white's central space control, though it also means temporarily neglecting the queenside development that might have been pursued with a move like qc7, reinforcing the center's potential. This bishop tucks back to a more robust diagonal, preparing to exert pressure along the a1h8 long diagonal while simultaneously adding support to the knight on e5, a piece that currently enjoys a commanding central outpost. Seeking to untangle his pieces and prepare a more active defense of his queenside, black repositions his knight to f6, a square that allows it to contest central squares and potentially eye the weakened e4 pawn, while simultaneously reinforcing the d5 pawn and offering a knight exchange if white pursues the knight on e5, solidifying the pawn chain and preparing a kingside expansion. This move aims to improve piece coordination while simultaneously blocking any immediate diagonal threats against the d4 pawn, challenging the central pawn structure and activating the bishop. This maneuver eyes the light squares and prepares for potential pawn breaks later. A strategic pivot to consolidate pressure on the queenside, aiming to support a potential advance of the b-pawn or create new attacking avenues by relocating the queen to a more active square where it can cooperate with the knights. This knight maneuver, shifting to the edge of the board, immediately seeks to influence the central pawn structure and potentially open lines for its comrades. Observe how the bishop now eyes the weakened kingside squares, creating a subtle but persistent threat. White's queen, though centralized, might feel a touch of discomfort as black's pieces begin to coordinate with increasing purpose. It's a quiet repositioning that could blossom into significant pressure if white isn't careful. Reclaiming the central e5 square with the rook, white signals a clear intention to fight for dominance along the c-file, potentially putting pressure on black's queenside pawn structure and aiming to disrupt the harmony of their pieces, especially the bishop pair. Emboldened by the queen's secure outpost, black initiates a pawn thrust, aiming to broaden their influence on the queenside and contest the nascent queenside pawn majority. White appears to be cultivating, potentially forcing concessions or opening avenues for their pieces to infiltrate enemy territory. The bishop retreats, opening a diagonal that could become crucial for controlling key squares should black attempt to advance their queenside pawns further. A daring pawn thrust aims to shatter white's queenside solidity and potentially open lines for black's rooks, though it risks creating weaknesses if unsupported. The bishop is repositioned to the active a3 square, immediately pressuring black's queenside pawn structure and threatening to disrupt the harmony of their pieces. Preparing to contest the open d-file with the rook seems like a sound idea, aiming to challenge white's centralized pieces and potentially create counterplay along that avenue. Bypassing the established pawn chain, this maneuver boldly challenges black's queenside structure, aiming to exploit the potential weaknesses created by the advanced a-pawn and disrupt black's planned pawn breaks. Unleashing the bishop from its passive role, black seeks to activate this piece and potentially disrupt white's central pawn structure, while simultaneously freeing the path for further piece development and preparing to contest control of the central files. White intends to reclaim central influence and prepare for potential pawn advances on the queenside. Black repositions the knight to a more central outpost, eyeing potential weaknesses in white's kingside pawn structure and preparing to challenge the d-file. Cracking open the queenside with b5 aims to shatter black's defenses and seize territory, potentially unleashing attacking chances. Unleashing a pawn sacrifice to disrupt white's pawn chain and open the c-file creates a fascinating tactical crossroads, aiming to exploit the weakened structure and potentially force concessions in the queenside. Seizing the open file, the rook dramatically shifts, now menacing the queenside and threatening to unravel black's pawn structure, while simultaneously preparing to contest the crucial 7th rank. Unleashing the queen to centralize pressure after a tactical skirmish opens up intriguing possibilities for counterplay, immediately challenging white's bishop placement. The bishop retreats, repositioning itself to support the queenside and eye the central tension, preparing to potentially shift its influence towards the kingside if opportunities arise later, while also safeguarding against any immediate pawn thrusts on the c-file. Pivoting the rook from the half-open c-file to the center offers immediate activity, but it might be a touch premature, allowing white's bishop pair to become more menacing and potentially creating weaknesses on the queenside if black isn't careful with pawn structure. This injection of the knight aims to disrupt black's queenside initiative and create threats on the f7 square, potentially forcing concessions or creating weaknesses. A calculated exchange that clears the way for the rook to become aggressively active, now eyeing the weakened light squares around white's king and potentially forcing concessions. Reclaiming the bishop is a priority, stabilizing the center and preparing for potential king-side action, while the passed pawn on b5 becomes a significant long-term asset. The queen immediately returns to the fray, aiming to disrupt white's central control and challenge the bishop pair's influence on the d-file. A calculated exchange to simplify, potentially opening up lines for your rook on the c-file and reducing black's central piece activity. But it relinquishes the bishop's crucial role in defending the queenside and might grant black better piece coordination. The board explodes into sharp diagonals as the queen pierces white's defenses, forcing a royal retreat and dismantling their central pawn structure. A classic example of exploiting an exposed king, seeking to secure the vulnerable monarch and disentangle the army's defensive structure. This king repositioning aims to sidestep the persistent threats emanating from black's queen and bishop battery on the c-file, while simultaneously preparing a potential rook lift or a central pawn push to reanimate white's dormant pieces. Reclaiming lost squares and forcing a tactical reshuffle, the bishop retreats to a central outpost, challenging white's rook on the a-file and preparing to redeploy its influence towards the kingside. The rook now occupies a commanding central file, threatening to infiltrate the queenside and disrupt black's pawn structure, while simultaneously adding pressure to the isolated pawn on c6. Sacrificing the bishop to alleviate pressure, black initiates a remarkable simplification that drastically alters the board's complexion, aiming to untangle their pieces and steer towards a more manageable endgame, albeit with a material deficit. Securing the passed pawn's path demands careful repositioning. The rook now vacates the vulnerable first rank and eyes the 7th, preparing to contest open files and neutralize black's active bishop. Black's rook finds a vital post on the b-file, aiming to exploit the open nature of that lane and potentially support a pawn advance or even penetrate white's territory. Reclaiming the open file is a logical step, aiming to disrupt the pawn structure and possibly create threats down the 7th rank. Repositioning the bishop to attack the rook on b2 is a sound positional idea, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially gain material if the rook is mishandled. Initiating a pawn push that promises to dominate the 7th rank, aiming to restrict black's maneuvering space and potentially create weaknesses in the pawn structure. A prudent regrouping of the bishop, seeking refuge and re-evaluating its attacking potential from a safer square after the recent exchanges. Steering the knight back to its familiar outpost, white aims to bolster the central pawn structure and potentially prepare a kingside initiative. Though this repositioning does concede some central influence for the moment and allows black's bishop to exert pressure along the c-file. Safeguarding the monarch becomes paramount as black repositions the king to escape the bishop's long-range surveillance, preparing for potential defensive maneuvers and perhaps a future rook lift to the second rank. Unleashing the rook to command the only open file. This pressure on the b-pawn suddenly forces black to make a difficult decision, potentially exposing their king or weakening pawn structure further. Black's intention here is to secure the pawn structure and create a potential outpost for the knight on d7, preventing white from consolidating further on the queenside by restricting the bishop's influence and providing a solid defensive screen. A strategic redeployment begins, shifting the rook from its aggressive post to a more defensive, yet potentially influential, square, aiming to control the 7th rank and prepare for future maneuvering, while simultaneously inviting black's bishop to become slightly misplaced. The bishop embarks on a journey to the far corner, seeking to disrupt white's control of the queenside by targeting the weakened pawn structure. Shifting the knight to e1 signals a strategic redeployment, aiming to reinforce the center and potentially prepare for a pawn push on the kingside, seeking a more active role after the exchanges, boldly challenging the opponent's central control and aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure. Black initiates a pawn advance that seeks to open lines for their pieces and create dynamic counterplay. Re-establishing knight presence on f3 offers a flexible defensive posture, preparing to support the kingside if necessary and potentially reroute the knight to a more active square, perhaps e5 again, should the opportunity arise, while also maintaining pressure on the d5 pawn indirectly. Cracking open the center with the pawn offers a vital chance to simplify the position and activate the bishop pair. Recapturing the pawn with the knight immediately seizes central control, aiming to exploit the open diagonal towards black's weakened king and simultaneously preparing to contest the now more active light squares. Trading off that bishop now simplifies the position and frees up black's pawn structure, aiming to exploit the open files and the slightly misplaced white rook. Liberating the d-pawn opens a path for the remaining white pieces, aiming to create active play and potentially exploit the weakened black pawn structure on the queenside, where the bishop now finds itself in an awkward, inactive position. The rook's relocation to the d-file aims to activate it along an open pathway, potentially challenging white's central pawn structure and creating future attacking chances, while simultaneously preparing for a possible pawn advance on the queenside to gain breathing room. Opening the d-file now offers white a path to activate their remaining pieces and potentially create threats against black's somewhat scattered pawn structure, while simultaneously challenging the bishop's placement. Initiating the central pawn push is a bold attempt to break open the game and potentially create new attacking avenues, though it does grant white a passed pawn. The monarch is forced into a perilous march across the board. Activating the king into the center is the immediate priority, pulling the monarch from its precarious position on the edge of the board and preparing it to participate in defending the weak pawns and potentially supporting a counter-offensive. The rook slides to the first rank, aiming to exploit the precarious placement of black's king and potentially infiltrate the opponent's territory. The black king ventures out to d6, a bold, perhaps desperate, attempt to activate a piece that has been dormant in the corner. now seeking to participate in the unfolding endgame battle by challenging white's central pawn and potentially creating escape squares. The bishop hops to c2, aiming to establish better control over the central squares and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the queenside, while simultaneously safeguarding the now exposed white king. A quiet regrouping, repositioning the bishop to a more active square where it influences the center and prepares to join the attack on the kingside if an opportunity arises, while simultaneously defending against potential counterplay on the queenside. Capturing that isolated pawn finally unlocks the kingside for white's rook and aims to simplify into a more favorable endgame structure. Pushing the pawn forward here is an attempt to create an active passed pawn, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially win material if white isn't careful with their piece placement in the next few moves. The rook abandons the semi-open file, perhaps to regroup and support the isolated pawn on a4, although this relinquishes important pressure along the c-file. The bishop recaptures, simplifying the position and aiming to activate the queen on the open diagonal after the pawn advances. Activating the king towards the center is paramount, transforming a passive monarch into an active participant in the ensuing pawn tussle. The monarch's exposed position is finally being exploited, with the bishop's diagonal now offering a direct line of attack and forcing white into a defensive retreat, potentially sacrificing material for time. Securing the king's retreat to a safer square is paramount given the exposed nature of the current royal position. Seeking to exploit the open king's safety, black endeavors to centralize their monarch, aiming to become an active participant in the ensuing pawn race and potential endgame skirmishes. The king's pawn push aims to create space for the monarch and potentially prepare for a later advance of the kingside pawns, but it also opens up diagonal weaknesses on the light squares that black's bishop now eyes with great interest. Seeking to exploit white's slightly exposed monarch, black lunges toward the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's potential pawn advances and potentially create passed pawns of their own. On the queenside, the rook surges to the third rank, intending to exploit the precarious pawn structure on the kingside and potentially launch a mating attack against the exposed monarch. Snatching the bishop on a2 is a bold material grab, but it disconnects your pawns and opens lines that white can exploit. You've sacrificed pawn structure for a fleeting material advantage, which might prove costly as the endgame approaches. Consider how this isolated pawn on a2 will need defending and the free rein it gives white's rook on the reopened file. Sacrificing the rook opens up a clear path for the white king, preparing to join the fight in the center and potentially create counterplay against black's exposed monarch. The rook's repositioning to the fourth rank aims to challenge white's newly acquired space and potentially create counterplay on the queenside if white isn't careful. Reactivating the bishop along the long diagonal offers a new axis of pressure, aiming to disrupt black's pawn chain and potentially create threats against the vulnerable kingside. A bold attempt to reignite attacking possibilities on the queenside. The bishop retreating to e6 aims to unblock the path for the rook on d7, potentially creating a passed pawn or a mating attack if white's king can be sufficiently exposed. Pawn storming the kingside now, aiming to create immediate threats and potentially trap the black rook lurking on the h-file. A daring bid to activate the rook, aiming to disrupt white's king safety and perhaps create a passed pawn on the queenside, though it leaves the bishop somewhat exposed. The pawn's relentless march forward, creating a dangerous passed threat and forcing the black king to retreat further into its own territory, a clear sign of impending doom. embracing the chaos and simplifying the pawn structure. This capture fundamentally alters the king's safety, creating immediate weaknesses that must be diligently addressed. Seizing that pawn on h5 initiates a potential pawn race. But more importantly, it opens a crucial diagonal for your rook, threatening to infiltrate black's weakened kingside structure. The pawn push to h5 opens the h-file, a significant concession that makes the black king remarkably vulnerable, while simultaneously sacrificing the pawn's defensive duties. A calculated risk. This piece repositioning aims to exploit the open h-file while simultaneously reinforcing the potentially vulnerable dark squares around the king. The pawn's advance to b4 cracks open the position, aiming to exploit the open diagonal for the bishop and create a passed pawn threat down the queenside, while simultaneously challenging white's knight's comfortable placement.